Claudia, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm going to be a little bit formal and have a written script that I'm going to read from to help avoid Claudia angrily waving timed up papers at me, so hopefully this will help me keep the time. So today I'm going to discuss understanding childhood from my perspective as a scholar of children's literature. I contend that representations of childhood in children's texts have a profound impact on our collective notion of what it means to be a child. Children's literature can help us understand childhood, but it also plays a role in constructing it in the first place. Because children's literature is written and published by adults, the images of childhood found within are shaped by adult hopes, anxieties, and desires. What we may think of as childhood is in many ways a product of the adult's imagination, a product that is consumed by children with the potential to shape their own understanding of what it means to be a child and to be an adult. With this in mind, I've titled my talk, Is Childhood Real? I suspect Dr. Barrett is more likely to use words like juvenile and juvenile period rather than child and childhood when discussing monkeys, because childhood is a term loaded with cultural baggage. This is evidenced by the fact that the concept has changed over time, varies between cultures, and is influenced by class, gender, and race. What we think of as childhood is shaped directly by what we consider to be the child, and understandings of children vary between individuals too. If I were to survey everyone in this room right now, for example, and ask you to tell me what keywords you most associate with children, I can guess what some of the answers would be, and they'd probably diverge a little bit. Josie, where's Josie? There's someone here for you, Josie. These problems with definition don't mean that children aren't generally viewed as distinct from adults, or that people don't typically think of childhood as a unique phase. But it does mean that our thoughts on these things are not consistent. In this talk, I'm largely focusing on British children's literature, but I want you to keep in mind throughout that notions of what constitutes a good childhood vary enormously, and that issues like child labor, educational practices, child rearing techniques are approached really differently by different groups, and that's something that Jan Newbury talked about in her Take Two lecture last year. Some claim that childhood was invented in the 19th century, and although this is an overstatement, there is some truth to that claim. It's arguable that attitudes towards children changed more dramatically during the 19th century than in any other period. Today, we often think of childhood as conferring certain protections and privileges, and a lot of that stems from 19th century Britain, where various acts of legislation showed an increasing conviction that children had certain rights. Legal developments show clearly how understandings of childhood have changed. Think for a moment about the difference between the Factory Act of 1833, which you can see parts of up here, which limited working hours for children aged 9 to 13 to 9 hours per day, and more recent laws that guarantee things like child's right to privacy. These are vastly different worlds. Such changes were due in part to massive population growth in the 19th century, which meant children were highly visible. But just as important was the emergence of a prosperous middle class who could educate and entertain their children. They could afford an extended childhood, and money was to be made in furnishing toys, clothing, and literature specifically aimed at children. Businesses had a vested interest in promoting the concept of childhood, and I would argue they still do, and in turn, material culture helped to define understandings of what it means to be a young person. So I have some examples here of toys that some of you might associate with your own childhood, and there is, I think, a strong connection between toys and other objects of material culture, and at the very least our memories, right, of childhood and how we look back to our own childhoods. However, for poor and working class 19th century children, things were very different. Hundreds of thousands of children worked at any one time across all sectors of employment, increasingly in industrial and urban working conditions outside the home. So if you associate childhood with school days, keep in mind that it wasn't until 1900 that legislation was passed making education compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 12. Concern about conditions faced by working children led to reforms over the course of the century, but these did not happen overnight. In addition to the increasing attention paid to the needs of real children, the image of the child became significant in art and literature. Romantics like William Wordsworth saw the child as close to nature and as the embodiment of man's potential for goodness, and the child functioned as a symbol of innocence. Yet children were also seen as the embodiment of original sin, giving rise to sentiments such as children should be seen and not heard, must obey their elders, and must pray for salvation. Early children's literature tended to be religious and morally didactic, with tales of sinful children suffering horrible fates because they did not behave. The poem Beware of the Fire, for example, published in The Children's Friend in 1865, advises readers to remember Kate Morris, poor dear little girl, so merry, so active and bright, so happy and full of gay spirits when morn, a scorched blackened corpse the same night. So shaped by the belief that children were unruly, this blunt portrayal of a child's death is intended to protect children from physical harm by making them cautious. Meanwhile, other works focus on saving the child's soul. In his poem, Obedience to Parents, Isaac Watts writes that if a child disobeys, the ravens shall pick out his eyes, and eagles eat the same. Portraying children as inherently prone to sin, Watts uses fear to stir the child reader onto the right path. His goal is not simply to teach obedience, but to help children save their own souls. When I teach some of this literature in my classes, students are often surprised by the negative image of children it presents and by the level of violence, revealing how collective notions of childhood and children's literature have changed. However, as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is apparent, for example, with fairy tales, which many know from the ubiquitous Disney representations. Even a quick glance at older versions shows they contain content at odds with current views on childhood, but we also see similarities. An example is Charles Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood, translated from French into English in the early 1700s. When the wolf arrives at grandmother's house, he sprang upon the poor old lady and ate her up in less than no time, for he had been more than 3 days without food. The wolf's actions are attributed to his hunger, but when Little Red Riding Hood arrives, he does not immediately gobble her up. Instead, the wolf hid himself in the bed beneath the counterpane. Put the cake and the little pot of butter on the bin, he said, and climb up on the bed with me. Little Red Riding Hood took off her cloak, but when she climbed up in bed, she was astonished to see how her grandmother looked in her nightgown. Grandmother dear, she exclaimed, what big arms you have. The better to embrace you, my child. How we view the wolf's invitation to join him in bed reveals our assumptions about childhood and is crucial to how we understand Perrault's version. Some readers see this simply as a sign of the wolf's gluttony, while others see a scene of seduction. The wolf invites Red Riding Hood to come to him, she removes her cloak, and she climbs into bed. Lest you think that interpretation or these revisionings of the Red Riding Hood story are simply products of modern celebrity culture, let's take a look at Perrault's moral, which is stated clearly at the end of his tale. Young lasses, pretty, courteous, and well-bred, do very wrong to listen to strangers, and it is not an unheard thing if the wolf is thereby provided with his dinner. I say wolf, for all wolves are not of the same sort. There is one kind with an amenable disposition, neither noisy, nor hateful, nor angry, but tame, obliging, and gentle, following the young maids in the streets, even into their homes. Alas, who does not know that these gentle wolves are of all such creatures the most dangerous? Perrault is explicitly warning young maids to stay clear of charming men who, given the opportunity, would seduce them and bring about their ruin. This tale is just one example of how literature can instill gendered codes of conduct in young readers and shows that Perrault clearly saw childhood as an appropriate and necessary time to introduce concerns about sex and morality to young readers. Moving ahead a bit in time to the mid-19th century, we have the start of the Golden Age, which begins with the publication of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in the mid-1860s. So this is called the Golden Age of children's literature, and it lasts roughly up until the First World War. One of the most quoted books in the world, it's clear evidence of how influential and lasting children's literature can be. Lewis Carroll parodies earlier works of children's literature, including those by Isaac Watts, and expresses contempt for overt moralizing through the absurd figure of the Duchess, who tells Alice, everything's got a moral if only you can find it. Fun, fantasy, and child protagonists are characteristic of Golden Age literature, which idealized the child as fanciful and free and celebrated the child's imagination. But Carroll's text is not all sugar and spice, and neither are young Alice's experiences, which shows that even during this time of supposedly idealized representations, there were authors who presented their young readers with more complex depictions of childhood. In fact, Alice's adventures, for anyone who's read it, knows that they're downright nightmarish at times, including monstrous physical changes and multiple near-death experiences. Additionally, she herself is not truly an idealized child, as she shows frustration, anger, and contempt for the adult-like figures around her. And often these aspects of Alice's character are best captured through the original illustrations by John Tenniel, which you can see here. So we have on the left the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. You can see Alice kind of looking up, sort of glowering at these people at the table who are, by this point, have driven her quite insane herself. And then the final scene of her fantasy where she's was in this absurd court case and getting more and more angry and says, you know, you're nothing but a pack of cards. So she's not an idealized character. Another fantasy novel from the 1860s is Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies, which illustrates how images of childhood within children's texts could be employed to argue for social reform. The tale of Tom, a chimney sweep, who goes from being a real boy to becoming a so-called water baby, living in a fantastical world. It condemns child labor in the plight of many young chimney sweeps who died from their work. So these were very small children. They had to be physically small, and they would literally go up the chimneys with brushes, right, to clean the chimneys. Revealing Victorian Britain's social inequalities, Tom's life is contrasted with the comforts enjoyed by middle-class children. When he becomes lost in a maze of chimneys and ends up in the bedroom of a little girl in a wealthy household, Kingsley contrasts the idealized image of the child so prevalent in the period with the experiences of poor urban children. Tom looks at the girl and wonders whether she was a real live person or one of the wax dolls he had seen in the shops. Though Tom wonders if she is real, the contrast between the two children suggests that his position as the one at odds with the natural order of things, and that the material comforts the girl enjoys within her middle-class household are part of what defines a real childhood. Another children's text from the end of the Golden Age is Anne of Green Gables, familiar, I'm sure, to many of you here, whose outspoken female protagonist provides another good example of how children's texts can help promote social change. In this case, Lucy Maud Montgomery uses child characters to critique, among other things, the limitations placed on girls and women in the Edwardian era, especially the barriers to higher education. In the process, she iterates what she sees as critical to defining a good childhood, namely being loved, having a sense of family and belonging, having the opportunity to go to school, and enjoying the freedom to exercise one's imagination. But as the famous scene when Matthew gives Anne her beloved puff-sleeve dress demonstrates, some enjoyment of the material culture of the time, in this case fashionable clothing, and being accepted by a peer group are also seen as some of the pleasures and necessities of youth. I want to finish with some examples from my project on World War I children's literature, a subject that captures many of the things I've been talking about today, including changing ideas about the capabilities, rights, and responsibilities of children, the place of violence and death within childhood, and shifting gender roles. Wartime texts show that children were presented with competing notions of childhood, often within the same piece of writing. Some authors portray it as a period of innocence to be protected from the realities of war. Others frame it as a time to prepare for adult responsibilities. And some argue that children already have responsibilities as citizens that include contributing directly to the war effort. So, somewhat paradoxically, alongside tales lamenting child victims and using them to portray the barbarity of the German enemy, are tales celebrating child soldiers and praising children who make various sacrifices for the Allied cause. The story Mrs. Bunny's Refugee, gotta love that title, opens with a group of nervous young bunnies home alone, frightened by the sounds of warfare and worried about their mother who's gone out for food. It also depicts a vulnerable human child, Marcel, whom the bunnies find wandering, lost, and in tears. He is a helpless child victim in need of saving by the adult Mrs. Bunny, who shelters him in her home and eventually reunites him with his family. The powerless figure of Marcel and the young bunnies serve to garner sympathy for Belgian refugees and support for Allied involvement in the war. In contrast to this picture of child vulnerability, some writers suggest children have agency and don't have to wait until they come of age to become soldiers. And even in this text, one of those contradictions, there's a scene when the bunnies hear these noises and they arm themselves, but of course they don't have any actual weapons, so they're carrying pots and pans and a rolling pin, that kind of thing. But there's still this sense that the child can literally or figuratively step into that role of soldier. Indeed, the figure of the child soldier was widespread, appearing in fiction, nonfiction, and even advertising. This ad for Coco on the left, for example, which appeared in the children's periodical Work and Play in 1916, contains a picture of a small boy cheerfully holding a rifle. The caption reads, "One of Britain's future hopes lies in a virile, dominant manhood." Here the child embodies the nation's future, highlighting the importance placed on masculinity, military skill, and physical ability essential to the nation's success. A similar image appears in a 1915 ad for Castle's tablets titled "The Nerve of a Soldier" that ran in the magazine The Girl's Mirror. It includes a photograph of a small boy sporting what looks like a child-sized soldier's uniform and holding a rifle. With the caption, "Who said Germans?" the picture implies that he is ready and willing to combat the enemy. These ads, which ran in children's magazines, show how the image of the child soldier was exploited for a range of purposes. The fact that such images were used to sell things like cocoa shows how widely accepted the figure of the child soldier was, even as the Germans' use of young fighters was frequently cited as evidence of their supposed barbarity. As the need for soldiers became desperate, writers turned to children's literature to encourage boys to enlist once they came of age, or to encourage children to put pressure on their elders, often through shaming tactics. The child was used in propaganda as a recruiting tool, as seen in this poster, which returns us nicely to my opening remarks about the symbolism attached to the concept of the child, and how this concept is defined differently depending on adult needs. In this propaganda image, the child serves a couple of functions. Firstly, seemingly innocent children reading books and playing with toys remind adult males of what they need to protect by joining the fight. Secondly, they shame the adult into enlisting through the assumption that fathers will want to have a good answer to give when their children ask what they did to help win the war. In this picture, we also have a young boy playing with toy soldiers, suggesting that childhood itself is a training ground, and that the boy is already preparing for his future role as a defender of his nation. I would argue that such notions started well before the First World War and have lasted to this day. If we think of the Harry Potter books, for example, we can see the entire series frames Harry's childhood as a training ground for the battle he needs to undertake in order to preserve his community. So I've given you a few examples of how children's literature constructs the figure of the child and shows both continuity and change in our understandings of childhood. As long as adults remain authors of children's literature, it will continue to embody their understandings of children and reflect these back at the child reading the text. We can question whether the image of childhood represented in children's literature is real, but what really matters is the degree to which readers accept these representations and how these lasting images of childhood shape ongoing understandings of what it means to be a child. An important question to ask is how such pervasive narratives may affect the ways in which young readers see themselves and form their identities at an early age and envision the adulthood that awaits.
So thank you, Claudia. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really chuffed to be able to speak alongside Elizabeth, because I think her work is really interesting and she's helped me think about the things I do in very different ways. My talk follows on directly from what Elizabeth was just saying, because she was talking about, well, what does it mean to be a child? How do adults help construct what a child is? And I think we have used primates in exactly that same way. We have used primates to ask questions about what does it mean to be human? And the answer, to ask questions about human identity. And of course, just as Elizabeth has shown in the case of childhood, that often involves motivated reasoning of various kinds. So these books are, famous, and one of them is notorious for what it did to the discipline of primatology in particular. So Donna Haraway's Primate Visions, Gender, Race and Nature in the World of Modern Science. What she did there was she took the themes that run through how we construct primates, and they dealt with race and gender, but also family and nation and class, and showed how they kind of been written into the body of nature. Every primatologist in the world hated it at the time. This Primates in the Real World is a more recent book, and what Georgina Montgomery does there is, okay, she tells the story from the inside. That's why she's called it Primates in the Real World, as a kind of a counter to Donna Haraway's visions, which she suggests were not particularly accurate. And I think she's wrong about that. But the book is very interesting because what she does in it is she takes these ideas that when primatology started, it required people to take note of adventurers and explorers and animal, hunters, and all these people who went out into the wilds of Africa and South America at the time, and they were the ones who knew about primates. So they had all the lore about primates, and primatologists needed them to kind of know where to go and look, and to know what to start doing with respect to primatology, and then spend the rest of the time desperately trying to undermine this folklore in order to legitimize primatology as a science. So that's so there are these interesting kind of discussions about primatology and what it means and how it figures in the study of human origins. And then this one in the middle, Storytelling Apes, is my favourite. So what this does is she takes the stories that primatologists have written about the primates they study, and she subjects them to literary criticism. And it's fantastic, you should all read it. So she shows that books like In the Shadow of Man by Jane Goodall and Gorillas in the Mist by Diane Fossey, she shows that these are classic romance quests. They're the hero quest. You're going out, and they're going out to find the origins of human nature, and they are brave individuals who are, doing this alone, and they have to, struggle through, and that's how these ape narratives are presented. And then she says this very nice thing about people who study monkeys. They tend to write their memoirs tend to sound like 19th century novels. They have a huge cast of characters. There are lots of plots. There's the monkey plot, what the monkeys are up to, and then there's the human plot, the subplots of what the human observers are getting up to. And then in Almost Human, Shirley Strum has to deal with the fact that no one wants to accept at the time that her work is showing that female baboons are the core of baboon society, and this is at a time when male dominance and aggression are seen as the key to understanding baboons. So she was fighting against that particular narrative. And in The Land of Abu, Sarah Hurdy was looking at these are species. This is a species that regularly the males commit infanticide, and this was seen as a terribly aberrant behaviour. These were pathology, this pathology that this particular population had, and she had a real struggle to show that in fact this was in fact an evolutionary adaptive strategy, and people used to sort of boo her at conferences, and she had a real struggle, and they didn't like it, particularly because she was a woman saying this. They thought it was unnatural for her to talk about it this way. So these books came out just as I was starting my PhD, and they kind of really had an influence on how I then went to look at the primate societies that I studied. I studied mangabeys in Uganda and baboons and vervet monkeys in South Africa. And like Claudia was saying, the things that I'm interested in are social life and behavioural flexibility, and the similarities and differences between humans and other primates, with an eye to understanding that clearly I'm going to be vulnerable to these same kinds of biases that persist, and the kinds of stories that we tell about primates and human origin. So of course, at one and the same time, you do see very clear parallels between we are primates, we share a heritage with primates. So Intensive mothering is a characteristic of the primates. It's something you see in baboons, you see in vertebrates, you see in the apes, you see in humans. Expressive behaviour, which as Darwin put, in the expression of the emotions in man and animals. Animals do have particular emotional states. We can see them, we can study them. And also the importance of non-verbal behaviour and communication and touch is something that comes out when you study primates. And when you spend a lot of time in the field, away from the society you normally live in, what you come to realise as well is how, what's the word, arbitrary human society is. When you're out in the field every day, you suddenly realise that days of the week are arbitrary and clock time is arbitrary. It means nothing to the animals, you know, and it starts to mean nothing to you as well. You start to live in a different world and you recognise a different way of being. And at the same time, as you're recognising that, you're also recognising the kind of sheer ingenuity of human society, the ways in which we invent amazing things and then repurpose those things in interesting and unusual ways. And we do this, and that we have like the imagination to see things. This is my childhood thing. We have the imagination to see things in different ways and therefore imagine a different kind of world. So the interesting thing is, like, when you say what makes human childhood distinctive, in the field I work in, it's interesting that people have now come up with a particular definition of what childhood is. And what makes human childhood distinctive is, kind of, Liz has already said this, is the fact that we have one. Whereas, so if you look at humans, so in the area I work in, which you could kind of call biological anthropology, broadly speaking, childhood is defined as the period between weaning and when you become a fully independent adult who's capable of producing their own food, that you are productive, that you can feed yourself and look after yourself. And so that's the definition of childhood that people are now working with. Because a young baboon, for example, goes straight from weaning into being completely nutritionally self-sufficient. So they're considered to be juveniles, whereas humans have a childhood, then they move into a juvenile period where they become increasingly self-sufficient, and then they move into adolescence. So you see these differences, and part of the reason why you see these differences is because of the way in which we use material culture, and now we are dependent on it to become nutritionally self-sufficient and productive. So cooking is a highly constructed niche. We use control fire, we learn to control fire, we now cook our food, and as a consequence of cooking food, and you've got hunting, we use various kinds of tools for hunting, so you have to have the skills to use the tools to hunt and track animals, you have to be able to track them as well. Then once you've got them, you must butcher animals, you have to know how to cook things, you have to know how to gather particular kinds of plant food. Many plant foods are poisonous in their raw state, they have to be heavily processed in order to be edible, and all this has to be learned, and it takes time. And that's why, you know, so children are dependent on us while they learn these particular skills. And you can't live healthily on a raw food diet. We are absolutely dependent on cooking now. Our guts have got smaller, our teeth and jaws are smaller. It seems to the argument is it released a constraint on brain size, so brain size expanded. So we are dependent on cooking because it extends our ability to digest food. We do a lot of our digestion outside the body. And no talk about child is complete without a small child with a machete. So this is from Barbara Rogoff's book, which is about childhood as apprenticeship. And so the children are learning all these skills that will allow them to become self-sufficient adults. And they're also learning skills of how to understand other people. So Daniel Hutto, who's a philosopher, he's come up with written a couple of books on what he calls folk psychological narratives and how that gives rise to our ability to attribute mental states to others. Many people argue that this is some kind of built-in human ability that it has evolved and everyone has it. And, you know, people talk about it as a kind of module that just matures at the age of 4. And Hutto disagrees. He says, we know how to, if you look at the other primates, they know very well how to predict what other animals will do. They're very able to anticipate what other animals will do, but they don't explain what they're doing to each other. And that's really what we're doing when we are using these kinds of ideas about theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states. We don't need them to predict other people's behaviour. It's easy enough to predict behaviour on the basis of what someone's previously done. I know that, for example, John at the back there will put the kettle on when he comes to the office in the morning, because that's what he always does. But if I want to explain why, I need something else. So the way that his argument is, the narratives and stories we tell children in childhood are what give rise to the reasons for our actions, of how we come to be able to explain ourselves to others, and how we come to give reasons for action. And that's what makes the difference. That's how human worlds differ from other primate worlds. And this leads to, this is Clifford Geertz, the famous anthropologist, who said, this famous quote, that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. I take culture to be those webs and the analysis of it to be an interpretive one in search of meaning. And that's what Hutto's kind of getting at. That's what we're doing. We're providing reasons for our actions that give our lives meaning. And he suggests that that's a real distinctive difference between how the other primates operate. And this brings me now back to the point I kind of started with, which is sometimes we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful. No, it's not mine. I thought it was mine. That's why I panicked. I think we have to be very careful when we look at the other primates, because we are vulnerable to these kinds of biases. And sometimes I do worry that when we talk about human origins, that one thing we're doing is we are just presenting them to ourselves as we see ourselves today. So these are the Laetoli footprints. The fossil footprints are all we have. Everything else there is a reconstruction. So there's no evidence that this is what was happening. Right? I think it really does come from reading, Us magazine and People. And then the other thing that is brought out in this very nicely in this book by Margaret Sado, who deals with Harry Harlow's famous work on macaques, where he showed the importance of love, basically. The suggestion was infants only attach to the mother because they want food. They learn that the mother is the source of food, and that's the source of attachment. And Harlow's experiments are always thought, they're always sort of presented now as these kind of terribly ethically dubious experiments, but the context for them was to demonstrate that love was important, that there was such a thing as mother love. So he famously gave a soft, warm mother that couldn't provide food, and he offered an infant a wire mother that could provide food, and the infants regularly went to the cloth mother, and even though they couldn't feed from her. So it was comfort over food every time. And this was sort of suggested, this is the basis of attachment, et cetera, et cetera. And when these animals grew up, they were terribly disturbed because they hadn't had proper social contact. They'd literally been clinging to the terry toweling, dummy for their infancy. And Harlow went on to he was interested in this. It's like, well, clearly mothers, there's something more than a mother. The socialization matters in a way that is not simply provided by comfort. And he went on to do these other experiments where he, instead of giving infants mothers or cloth mothers or fake mothers, he just gave them no mother at all and raised little groups of peers together. Little groups of juvenile monkeys were raised together, infant monkeys. And he called them choo-choo monkeys because they would all hug each other in little trains like this. And these animals actually grew up to be fairly functional. They were able to mate, they were able to socialise with other animals in a way that the motherless mothers weren't. But interestingly, what she points out is this work was never as prominent and was never highlighted because it occurred just after the Second World War, when a lot of men were coming back to the States, when there was a need for men to have jobs, and women were encouraged to go back to the home and become homemakers. So you had John Bowlby also talking about attachment and the importance of the mother to normal development, and Harlow's work on mother, the importance of the mother for normal, the presence of a warm, comforting mother for normal development was presented in this way. So her argument is, sometimes we're presenting what we'd like to be the case and conveniently ignoring work that doesn't support that particular story that we want to tell. So everything always has to be taken in its political and social context. So what I just want to finish off with here is to talk about a particular study that I'm always asked about, and given there's a nice big crowd of people here, I can put it all to rest once and for all and never have to speak of it again. So this is a study about sex differences in response to children's toys by vervet monkeys, which are the monkeys I study. And I think this is an important thing to raise because everyone's, this idea of deep-seated biological differences between men and women comes up constantly, and it's used to argue that, well, women naturally favour caring professions which pay less. So, the gender pay gap is really your own fault. You shouldn't just, you just like these caring jobs. And, all this, these you can't be computer programmers because you don't have the analytical minds needed, ladies. Those kinds of arguments come up. And these studies like this can help, justify those kinds of things. And I don't think that's a particularly good way of, going about stuff, because I think these studies don't show what they purport to. So, in this case, they said, unlike humans, vervet monkeys are not subject to the specific social and cognitive influences proposed to explain human differences in toy preferences. And I would agree with that until this experiment was given to them, in which case they were exactly exposed to human social and cognitive influences in toy preferences. So what they did was they had a colony of monkeys, males and females, and they presented a series of toys to them. Like they had 6 toys that they classified as neutral, masculine or feminine. They put them in the cage one at a time and saw how much the animals would respond to them and looked for sex differences in their response. So the neutral toys were a stuffed animal toy and a book. The masculine toys were a police car and a ball. And the feminine toys were a baby doll and a frying pan. A saucepan, a red saucepan. So this is me reading this paper. So I would suggest that what you're exposing, I have never seen a vervet monkey with an easy bake oven, for example. So I've never seen that in all the years we've been watching them. So these are the they show you pictures of here's a female playing with a female doll, here's the male playing with the car. Now there are many problems with this study besides the stimuli, which I could get into, but what I want to say is the problem that really strikes me is this shows no understanding of the vervet social system whatsoever. So if you look at vervets, what you can show is that first of all, juvenile females are much more aggressive than juvenile males throughout life. Okay, so this is beginning at weaning for over a course of 3 years. So this is animals at the beginning of the weaning, at the end of the weaning period, they're just becoming juveniles, and it goes through to roughly the end of the weaning period. So females are consistently more aggressive than males. Vervets are territorial. They have intergroup encounters that where they have all this sort of the two troops will meet at a boundary and go backwards and forth and fight over the boundary. And in those encounters, females are as likely, if not more likely, to be aggressive than males. These things are always led by the females. So females are generally, they're not showing the kind of pattern you would expect given their preference for dolls. In baboons, this is how the dominance rank goes. All the females would be at the bottom and all males would outrank them. And when we came to do vervets, we kind of came, it's interesting because this is where I see these biases, we came with this kind of baboon mindset. And we were first of all putting males and females in separate dominance hierarchies to do our analyses. And then one day, having seen all these females sort of whacking males around, and we're like, why are we doing this? We should make a combined hierarchy and see what that looks like. And it looks like this. So what you see here is males and females are completely interdigitated. And in some years, the purple are the females outrank all males in the group. And this is despite males being a third, they're a third bigger than females. So, when we put this together, when this came out, we all went like this. It was amazing to us that we hadn't realised this before. And the other thing that's important is that this shows you, the grooming eigenvector is a measure of how much, it's a kind of network measure of how integrated you are into a social network. I'll just leave it at that. And what this shows is that as grooming eigenvector goes up, this is males being integrated into the female network. The more integrated a male is into the female network, the higher his predicted rank improvement through time is. Male dominance rank with other males depends on their being integrated into the female hierarchy. And the higher the number of partners they have, ooh, the numbers have got a bit funny there, the higher the number of partners they have, female partners they have, again, that predicts their rank improvements. Staying in close proximity to females increases male rank with other males. And finally, males, this graph shows you the share of mating that the alpha male in a given group gets, and then his paternity subsequently. So these are genetic analyses of paternity. So what you can see here is that some males sometimes get quite a big share of the mating, no paternity at all, even though they're mating. Some males don't seem to do much mating, but they end up being the fathers, which suggests that females have some control over who is fathering their offspring, either by the timing of the mating, when they're ovulating, or by cryptic female choice, of females selecting male sperm in their reproductive tracts, for which there is good evidence from other species. So vervet females are pretty formidable. So even if that study was completely accurate and it was very well done, and those results that showed vervet monkey females prefer dollies and vervet monkey males prefer police cars, it wouldn't tell you very much about the sex roles that these animals engage in their real world. So to end, I would just like to say that this is always something I think it's important to live by if you are a biological anthropologist, as Ashley Montague was, that we shouldn't base that image of ourselves on false foundations, because what's involved here is not simply the understanding of human nature, but also the image of humanity itself that grows from that understanding.